Well, I was in a touring band for a real long time, and I think one of being in a touring band where you're playing experimental music. I know a lot of experimental musicians who don't end up being that experimental because there's a ton of, you want to hold on to it. It's a kind of older model where I think you're working more with being focused on, I'm going to produce an object that's going to stand for a certain amount of time. It's almost a stand-in for the amount of time that you worked in it. So it has to have a certain kind of weight to it, where it's like, well, that time doesn't really, that's not how that time existed anyway. It's the same as a clock, or even this, like, of course it's a recording, so people aren't going to hear this in real time, but even the people who are in the room, you guys aren't hearing it when I'm saying it, you're hearing it after. So that kind of latency, I think that I wouldn't call it liminality, but there is a space between the presented and the realized, or the imagined and the realized, that is a very legitimate space of practice that you can find a lot of space in. For me, it's just to reduce anxiety. I mean, when I do studio visits with other people, there's usually a certain amount of anxiety in the studio. I'm trying to do this, I want it to come off like this, and I'm like, well, this is the only place that I have sovereignty, so I'm gonna do what I want to have a more exciting time and a richer time, rather than it being like something where, I don't know, I always think about it of mice and men. Either you hold on to it too tight and you kill it, or you hold on to it too loose and it gets away. But having that kind of facility with that space is more engaging for me. Um, I mean, materially based, I really like to think about things that I can use and I can be super improvisational with. Not to say that it's kind of ham-fisted or ham-handed, but that you can make not even a dumb sculpture, because it's not really about de-skilling. It's more about those things which are common enough to not be precious with, so that you can have an experimental space. There's a fair amount of sound in the work. There's a lot of drawings. There's some printmaking. There's some heavy metal vests, kind of detorned. There's a lot of basic situationist approaches to material, just kind of switching them so that there's a level of defamiliarization. I mean, audience is a tough thing, right? Because you can't, I mean, in a truly social environment, if you make food, you can figure out the drop-down menu, right? Like, it has to be edible, it has to be servable, and in a lot of ways, you would think about something like, well, it has to be vegan because you know vegans are in the world, right? To allow for everything. But someone might be a meat and potatoes guy. I mean, I think the people that I work with on a regular basis, like my crew in Detroit, who we run the gallery together, we think a lot about, is there something for the people who are super digitally minded? So when I make a show, I definitely think of it all as sculpture, but of course, photography, drawing, fabrication, all of those things are going to be in there, because our basic metric is do you walk into the show, and would we as artists be like, I wish we would have thought of that, or we wish we would have did that. I mean, as a musician, because so much of the show is sound-based and because there are performances inside the show, I think a lot of it is about making sure that there's a lot of different frequencies for people to jive with. Because essentially, if you only make that high-pitched frequency that's annoying to one person in the room, they're like, do you hear that? Oh my God, that's terrible. But actually, that's just one frequency. There are probably 30 to 60 to 100 other frequencies in the room, but one person is being annoyed by one frequency. So I kind of think about that as a flip, that you can make a bunch of frequencies that are very warm or enviable in that space, that are going to allow for people to buy in, essentially. And one of the things is to make sure that it's visually interesting. I think that sometimes that, especially as a student and having seen a lot of art, even you talking to students especially, sometimes that's something that's forgotten, especially once you start getting a conceptual or philosophical bearing to your work, or you start like having a syntactical basis. You might forget that it has to be visually interesting. Otherwise, people aren't going to look at it, and it's not going to leave a stain. So I definitely always try to make it visually. That's a start point for sure. When I look at the world, I guess the anxiety that maybe ends up in the work is based on consensus Buddhism. I mean, I'm not a Buddhist, but in consensus Buddhism or Zen, much of the conversation is about kind of like assuming that there's kind of hope at the end of the road, right? And that's kind of faith-based with Western religion. And as a pretty like, I don't know, someone who's really into the corporal acts of mercy and thinks about like that as a kind of defining factor of how to organize my time, I'm also like much more interested in the charnel ground. That at the end of the day, there isn't really hope necessarily. I mean, that is the assumption of a certain strain of Buddhism when it's kind of more honest about what it is, because the Western form is that, no, you know, actually, if you just do these few things, it's all going to work out. But the charnel ground is that like there is an actual place where you kind of dump bodies that don't have any other place in the world. And that in that kind of mythological framework, it's going to attract vampires and bloodthirsty demons and witches and all of these other kind of like what we wouldn't consider to be like things of this world. And inside of that, once you kind of recognize that, it's not that there's some like layer of hope at the bottom of that, but there's an incredible possibility for creativity, because you no longer are basically locked into this kind of like worldly ethos, especially on the Western side of like production and value and consumerism.